Thank you, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our seminar, our usual seminar. And or, not so usual, and I would say exceptional. We have the privilege to having with us Professor Siders from Delaware University. Siders is the director of the Climate Change Science and Policy Hub. She is an associate professor at the University of Delaware in the Disaster Research Center. What better for us? And she is a lawyer with a degree from Harvard University, Harvard Law School, and a PhD from Stanford University. And you will hear her. She has a lot of interesting points to give. So I don't need to go farther more, but I really thank you for coming and taking the time. We hope to work in the future together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, especially on short notice. When I realized I was coming to Italy, I said, oh, well, we should do something. So this was great to get this managed. Apology, I don't normally worry about people hearing me in the back, but I'm having some allergies issues, so if you can't hear me, and this is far more common, I tend to speak very quickly, even for English audiences. So if you find that I am starting to speak way too quickly, just give me some signal, and I will slow down. Yes, do not feel ashamed to give me a signal. I speak far too quickly, as I'm constantly reminded. So I am going to talk about a number of issues, but these are the key takeaways. So I want to think about the ocean's decade, right? The science we need for the ocean we want, and how do we get the ocean we want? And these are the answers, I think. We do more, we eat more veggies, we think about adaptation as a process of choice rather than as an outcome. We acknowledge that justice is complex, which is where I'll spend most of today. And we be creative and we play. So those are my answers for you. Yeah? And not to get through before you get that photo. Yep. Oh, nope, I can't advance my slides. Hang on, there we go. Okay, yep, right. Oh, okay, yeah. The science we need for the ocean we want, and we can talk about who the we is in a minute of that one, because that's very important for environmental justice. All right, but the ocean we want. And for those of you who I've met in Atlanta, you know that normally what I like to do here is challenge you to write a haiku about the future that you want. Yeah? I'll come back to that. But if anyone wants to write a haiku, this is great. And if not, just think really critically about the future that we want. So I already gave these answers. How do we get to that future that you want to build? And these are the pieces. So let's start off with doing more and eating more veggies. Why we need to do more. This is a study by Magnan et al., and they did an analysis looking at 61 examples of coastal adaptation in big cities, big projects around the world, trying to assess how well they were doing. And basically, this was their conclusion. Half, or halfway. Yeah? Now, you can have all kinds of questions about what half means in this context, and people have lots of questions. But the big takeaway is that the world is doing more adaptation than we have ever done before, and at best, we might be halfway. So we're doing more than we've ever need to done, and we very likely need to do at least twice as much more. Okay? So your takeaway should not be more, but not just a little more, a lot more. Yeah? So more. This is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their assessment on risks and vulnerabilities. Key takeaways are negligible evidence that existing responses are adequate to reduce climate risk, either now or in the future. Soft limits are currently being experienced, and hard limits for coastal communities will be experienced beginning at 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's worth noting that over the last year, the world has already been experiencing 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, so likely some communities are already hitting those hard limits. Now that's a temporary blip. We don't expect to hit that permanently for now, but already some of these hard limits and soft limits to our current adaptation strategies are being hit or will be hit very soon. And evidence of maladaptation is increasing. It's hard to know necessarily to prove that you need more. So for the US, this is my go-to slide on why we know we need more. This is the number of billion-dollar disasters each year. Yeah, so the number of disasters that each cost more than $1 billion. And we broke records last year with 28 unique disasters that were each more than $1 billion. Total about $100 billion in damage. You can see the average has been, or the rise from the 1980s. We're up to about 5 to 6 major disasters, billion-dollar disasters a year. That's up from about 3 in the 1980s. We've also relatively doubled the deaths per year due to disasters since the 1980s. Depending on how you count, some estimates from last year are 86,000 people died in the United States alone from these kinds of disasters. So, is this evidence of adaptation, sufficiency? No, but I'm going to use this to suggest that we are clearly not doing enough, at least in the United States, right? If we can't level this out, if we're still accelerating our major disasters, something is going wrong here. And we can also see this, because I'm going to talk about relocation, we can also think about this specifically in the flooding realm. So the dark blue is the number of repeated flood loss properties. So properties that have flooded, been repaired, flooded again, and received federal aid for that in the United States. And the light blue and the very light gray are the ones that have been helped. They have reduced their flood risk. Yeah? So one, check out the proportion of light blue to dark blue. It's pretty small, yes? And then what I'd also like to note is that number of people that has been helped is about 45,000, but the number of new repetitive loss properties is estimated at 64,000 over that same time period, which means that the problem is getting worse faster than we are helping to fix it. Yeah? And again, spending more money than ever before and not even flattening that trajectory. Yeah? And this one isn't quite as steep as the others, but we're definitely not heading in the right direction. Yeah? The problem is getting worse despite spending billions and billions of dollars. In the United States, we spend a lot of time on repetitive flood loss properties because they account for 1% of properties, but roughly 30% of the expenditures in flood disaster. So they alone account for about $12.5 billion worth of spending in the National Flood Insurance Program. So 1% of properties, half of the National Flood Insurance Program debt. Yeah, so if you could fix this. So recently in Louisiana, so those numbers are in my head, they have just about 7,000 severe repetitive loss properties that account for $1.2 billion of damage in that state. So if you could just solve the problem for 7,000 properties, which feels much more manageable than solving all of flooding problems in Louisiana, right? You could address $1.2 billion worth of damage. So it's a big, big ask. Now, one of the reasons that this is getting much worse is climate change. That climate is causing more disasters, more frequent. Go ahead.
Go.
Become problem. The other is that we are actively making the problem worse. So this is true globally. I just don't have the numbers globally. For the United States, we are actively building in the floodplain. So in some states, we are building faster than we are outside of the floodplain. So I'm from Delaware. In southern Delaware, they're building 3 times faster in flood-prone areas than they are in safe areas. Specifically, they're building in the 10-year floodplain. And I like to translate that into the place where it is 96% certain that your home will flood before you pay the mortgage. Okay? 3 times faster we're building there than outside of it. That's because we have local control and federal expenditures. And so the mismatch between who has the authority to fix the problem and who has the financial incentive to fix the problem, those two things aren't aligned, and so we get this. So across the United States, over the last 20 years, we've had 2.1 million acres of floodplains have been developed. That means turned from grass or green into something impervious. Okay? And 844,000 new homes have been added in the floodplain, in the 100-year floodplain as mapped by FEMA, which is an underestimate of risk. So those numbers are probably higher when we think about real risk. But in terms of regulatory risk mapped by our federal agency, almost 1 million new homes. But the flip side of that is that half of those are in Florida. Yeah? And that actually only 13% of US towns are doing a bad job at building out the floodplain. Many in Florida. Yeah? And so it's a story of that looks like a terrible story across the United States, but actually it's not. It's a story that is bad in a few places, and a few places that are so bad that they make everything else look bad when you aggregate out. Yeah? I mean, 844 million or 1,000 homes sounds really, really bad, but if I told you that that was 400,000 over across the entire United States and then 400,000 in Florida, the rest of the United States doesn't look quite so bad. Still bad. They shouldn't be building any. That number should be 0, but not quite so bad. Yeah? And so this becomes important. Oh, this is my side note here, is that along with this, anyone here who's doing modeling on coastal risk, right, if you are not modeling out population growth and land use issues, you are missing the majority of the uncertainty. So one study a student at University of Delaware recently did, Mananhar, looked at this, found that land use and population accounted for 6 times as much uncertainty in storm damage estimates as which model you used or what sea level rise projection you used or basically any of the other factors you would normally put in. So you can use the most simplistic bathtub model you want, because if you're not using population or land use, it doesn't matter. That is a negligible amount of the uncertainty in your estimates. Yeah? I mention this because I've recently had a number of fights with agencies who don't want to include population or land use in any of their estimates of risk because they feel that that's too normative. Yeah? So there's a concern here. Anyway, the reason this is interesting that only 13% are doing this is because we did a study looking at towns that are trying to avoid floodplain development, and we find that how are they doing this? Well, the towns that are doing well have a few high-quality, commonplace, normal legal towns, normal zoning codes, normal programs, and they're just doing their jobs. It is like the unsexiest paper ever to try to write. How did they succeed? They did their jobs every day for years. I have started calling this the equivalent of the diet paper, right? Where how did they succeed, achieve amazing weight loss? Well, they ate veggies, thank you very much, and they went to the gym every day for several years, right? Was it a miracle pill? No. Was it an amazing new technology? No. You know what they did? They ate their veggies, they went to the gym, and that's it. And everyone wishes they'd have them. They ate veggies. Sorry, eat your vegetables. Yeah. Thank you. They ate their veggies, and they went to the gym, and that's it. There wasn't a magical new fix. There wasn't some amazing new technology. There wasn't an amazing new, I wanted to find that the towns that had done well had a new, amazing legal code, because then it would be simple, right? I could say, here's the solution. Everyone just adopt this new legal tool, and that would solve it. But it wasn't. It's actually the much simpler, but much more difficult answer of how do you convince towns to consistently do their jobs every day for the next few decades. It doesn't require any innovation, it doesn't require any major new technologies, and yet is far more difficult to achieve, I think. Yeah? Thank you for this. Yeah, this is my favorite quote at the bottom. It's nothing special. It's like, yep, there's no special. So yeah, there's no quick fixes. All right, there's no magical solution to all of this. All of this is just eating our vegetables and doing what we need to do. That's the first one. Stationarity is dead. All right, this is a Millie et al. Paper. They said, stationarity is dead. Where does water management go from now? Right? What do you do when the system is not stable? Yeah. And I think this is important because this IPCC also mentions that responses across all sectors are minor modifications to usual practices. So the vast majority of adaptations that we found, we looked at over 1,900 different academic studies documenting adaptations around the world, right, are it's hot, drink water. It's hot, plant trees and stand in the shade. Is it dry? Irrigate. That's it. Those are our solutions to climate change. Is it flooding? Elevate your homes 6 inches. Yeah, that's it. Those are the vast majority of adaptation options that we are seeing. And we looked for areas that were doing more transformative adaptation, more in-depth transformative adaptation. And nope, that has gone too far. You don't get to see it. And you're looking for that dark blue. So dark blue is where we found evidence of transformation. And you will note that there is not any dark blue on that map because we did not find any evidence of transformative adaptation. We had to find 3 examples in any sector in order to color it in. So we couldn't find 3. We could find 1 or 1 here or 1 there, but not enough. Yeah, overall, we estimate that more than 70% of the adaptation actions that we documented are all incremental changes. None of them they're not transformative. Well, the reason I think this is important, I think this comes to an underlying presumption that what we are trying to do with adaptation is to maintain the status quo. We want people's lives to change as little as possible in the face of climate change. We want you to be able to adapt to climate change without changing the crops that you plant, without stopping being a farmer, without having to change your livelihood, without having to move, without having to build in a different way, without having to challenge any of our socio or political or economic norms. We want to deal with climate change with the smallest number of modifications. And to continue my diet analogy, this is like me wanting to be a size 2, but to continue eating Snickers bars for breakfast, right? So if I go to the gym once a week, that will do it, right? Sure. And we know that's insane, but I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put a Band-Aid, right, on an amputated limb. It's obviously not working, and yet we think if we just double down. And this is why we can't just do more. When I say we need to do more, we can't just do more, because more of the same thing will not help us. We have to do something very, very different. And we have to do something that is very different and thinks about change in a different way, so that our goal is not to prevent change. These are photos of my hometown. I'm from Duluth, Minnesota. In the United States, that's something of a joke, because I study people relocating due to climate change, and not due to any of my efforts. Duluth, Minnesota has been labeled as a climate haven for people to relocate to, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. But the main thing I want you to think about is your hometown and my hometown have changed a lot in the last 80 years. 80 years, 1944, the US is preparing for D-Day. Like this is, right? Like things have changed just a little bit. Yeah, Europe has changed a little bit since then. Yeah, we've seen some global changes. No matter what your hometown is, it probably looks different. It's harder to say in Europe, where a lot of things there are buildings. My godparents are in the United Kingdom and like to point out churches that are older than my country. So there's more history, or different history, but also there's a lot of change. There's also things that are changing, and frankly, it would be bad if 80 years from now my hometown looked exactly the way it does today. That would not be success, right? That would be a bad thing. And so any effort we take to try to maintain the way the world looks today might be counterproductive, might actually be a bad alternative. Yes, and we can actually see this. I was thinking about this a lot in Rome last week, because sometimes I work with people on heritage, and we think about preserving heritage. And there's a lot of heritage we should preserve. And we'll also note that the Sistine Chapel's floor is built from the remnants of other holy sites that the church demolished and ground up and used as tile. San Clemente is built on a church that is on top of a different church, on top of a different church, on top of an apartment complex, on top of a Roman temple. So that heritage has been preserved, but also changed. Yeah, and so when we talk about even heritage preservation, the idea isn't to preserve everything exactly the way we have it today. Some things have to allow for change in order for other things to happen. Right? The Sistine Chapel only exists because it was painted over something that was there before. Right? These beautiful things we have that are heritage now, right, were change when they came about. And so we have to be open to that idea. So I know it's a bit metaphysical for this talk, but we're going to talk about justice, so we're going to stay metaphysical for a while, yeah? But I think this is a different mindset around adaptation. Yeah? If the world is going to be in constant change from now on, sometimes I think we talk about climate change as though we are moving from one position of stable climate through a time of change to another period of stable climate. That might be true in the long term, but it is not going to be true on any of our lifetimes, or our children's lifetimes, or our grandchildren's lifetimes. They are always going to live in that period of instability and non-stationarity. And so we can't think about adaptation as how will I adapt once from here to a new normal. We have to think about how we will live in a time and in a way that is under constant change. Okay? To put this in really clear terms, if I'm going to elevate my home, I can't imagine that I'm going to elevate my home once to those new flood heights unless I go very, very high, right? I'm going to elevate, and then the sea levels are going to rise, and I'm going to elevate again, and they're going to rise again, and I'm going to elevate again, and they're going to rise again. And so the issue isn't how high do I elevate. Maybe the question should be, if we know that that change is going to be constant, how do we think about a building in a way that allows for change over time? That makes it easier to elevate in the future, rather than making that complicated and difficult every single time we do it. Yeah, so that non-stationarity, I think, actually puts us in a different mindset for how we think about change. It also means that we are in a process of changing. Rather than adaptation as a one-time action, it's a process that we should be putting in place. And that process is about choosing how we change. This is a framework I like a lot by some colleagues at the US Geological Survey. They actually use this when they look at natural resource management. They call it the RAD framework, resist, accept, direct. They say you have three choices when faced with climate change affecting a resource you care about. You can resist the change, you can accept the change, or you can direct change and purposely try to make change. And this makes sense when I think about my hometown. There are going to be some pieces of heritage, some community ties, some inherent characteristics that we want to preserve, that I want to maintain. There are going to be some changes that I really don't care about. I talk to my students about this and I say, I really don't care what music sounds like 60 years from now. Other people might. That might be something they want to fight to preserve, but right, fashion, music, I don't know, other things will change and we will accept that change. It will come or not, right? And then there's gonna be some change that we purposely want to direct. And maybe that's things like, I want more parking, I want more accessible buildings, I want more cafes and bookstores, I want a more just and equitable society. It could be small, it could be big. But there are things we're going to purposely change to not maintain the status quo. So adaptation is not about maintaining today against shocks and against change, it's about choosing the way we pick what we want to preserve in a way that enables us to change multiple times over time, or to have a continual way of changing. And this is a challenge because none of our social systems are set up to do that. We tend to make decisions thinking that we can just pick the tools. We can pick to resist, accommodate, avoid, retreat. I have concerns about advance as a mechanism, but sure, advance as an adaptation strategy. And some people are building out into the ocean as a way of adapting to, sure, okay. So how are we gonna blend those? And we can blend those in ways that create very different futures. And all of that is going to be based on our values and what we care about, right? Our goals. Do we care more about economic benefit? Do we care more about justice? Do we care more about the environment, which often gets left out of this? Do we care about ecosystems or not? What do we care about? And as an example, I think about this study from Link and Hinkle a lot, where they looked at the global coastline from an economic perspective and come to the conclusion that only 13% of the global coast is economically robust to protect. 65% of it should be abandoned from an economic perspective. The remaining 22% is mixed. Okay. When I think about 13% of the global coast, that's not much. Right? And from an economic standpoint, I have no doubt their calculations are correct. But everyone in this room probably had a gut reaction where you thought, oh no. I don't want to just abandon the rest of the coast. Maybe it's not economically beneficial, but there might be heritage sites, there might be indigenous populations, there might be some ecosystems of incredible value. There might be something that we care about at a non-economic level. And yes, I know there are arguments that we could just improve the economic models to include those things, but there are things that are not economically valued that we care about that might make us want to protect areas even if it is not economically rational. Heck, we might just want to do it to have a diverse coast, to not just save areas of dense urban infrastructure, but to also save some areas of rural existence. Okay? We might have other values. So I say this just as one example of how our goals and our values clearly would shape what our strategy would be. So when we think about that, we think about justice. And then, well, people often think of a lot of different terms here: fairness, equity, justice. What do we want those values to look like? And this isn't easy, and I'm a lawyer, so we could spend days talking about this one, and there's only a few thousand years of people thinking about what justice means, so I'm not going to solve that this afternoon, nor probably in my career, right? But when we try to narrow down, right, so what does it mean in a climate adaptation context? And that's still too broad. So what does it mean in particularly a managed retreat context, a relocation context? That's what I study. And I think it's one of the most controversial. And just as a background, right, when we think about categories of ways to deal with coastal risks, you have resistance, try to prevent the water from reaching you. You have accommodation, let the water come and go, but it does less damage. You have avoidance, don't build there in the first place. As I noted, we're not great at that. Yes. Or relocate. After you've built there, get out of the way. That's basically it. And I mention this because I remember having a conversation with a coastal practitioner. He wanted help knowing what to do in his town. I said, well, you can build a giant seawall, but we won't do that. That would cut off our access to the coast. Okay, resistance is out. We talked about nature-based strategies. Those were considered too expensive or ineffective. Okay, resistance was out. Okay, you could accommodate. We talked about a variety of accommodation. Okay, he said those were out. All right, I said, well, you could not build there in the first place. He said, well, it's too late for that. And I said, well, you could relocate. He says, we're never going to relocate. And then we paused because he was waiting for more options. And I said, nope, we've run through it. That's the list. That's all I had. You know, if you rejected all of the options on the menu, can we start at one again? That's it, right? That's all I have. So there are variations in each of these, right? And each of these are a major category. Just as a local context, right? Italy is dealing with thinking about how they're going to do managed retreat right now for the Campi Flegrei. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but are experiencing massive earthquakes in the last year, forever, but in the recent year has become much more significant, and came to my attention when my phone gave out emergency alerts that Italy had a super volcano about to go out. While I was in Italy, I paid attention to that headline. So this one popped up. But note that I found interesting parallels on, here's an area of land that officials know is at risk, they just don't know when. Okay? But it's economically beneficial to build on it, and so they have allowed building and development to occur on it, to the point where now almost 500,000 to 1 million, depending on the risk zone, people live in this area that is at risk. And now, what do you do? And to put this in a justice context, I think here's one of the really interesting dilemmas that they will almost certainly face. Who do you evacuate first? Do you evacuate people who have, say, the least means first? That would be one environmental justice principle, right? You think that they need to get out first because you're worried about them staying and being at risk. On the other hand, if you take them out first, they'll be displaced for the longest. Maybe they'll have difficulty finding replacement housing. Do you provide that housing? It'll have a different commute. Maybe it'll disrupt school systems. On the other hand, do you leave them for last? Right, they'll experience the fewest disruptions, but run the greatest risk that you will have sort of an emergency and crisis at the end, and they may have the fewest options to evacuate and to deal with that emergency crisis at the end. There are good theoretical arguments on both cases, and some poor person is going to have to make the call. And I don't have an answer for them on how you do that. So, and there's a variety of others. This one's, earthquakes and volcano obviously have different return periods and therefore different calculations than in a flood zone, but actually a lot of parallels, I think, in how you think about the incentives to develop in areas known to be risky, how you think about those trade-offs, how you put people on alert, how you think about evacuation, and how people are going to deal with the aftermath when and if that volcano goes.
Can I?
Yeah.
I mean, I did the same, in the last 2 weeks there was this event, and I did exactly the same analysis with your work. And the feeling I had of reading the news is that the government was proposing to allow, to put incentives on people that wanted to, that were ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
But then, so basically on a voluntary basis, it could already be a success of relocation. But on the other side, this means a lot on the education, on the information you have been able to provide, the risk perception.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe before starting with the risk perception increase, and then of course you would have more people ready to relocate.
Risk perception and other options. Because most of us make decisions about where we live. Like risk is only going to be one of many criteria. And for most people, it's the smallest, right? Like how expensive is the housing? How close to work is it? How close to family or schools? What kind of housing, right? Is it on the second floor, first floor? We're mentioning my husband does motorcycles, so we needed a garage. All of those criteria are going to come in, and only then do people start thinking about, well, does it flood? Does it have a, right? What other risk factors do I want to think about? Right, most people are not making housing decisions based on those risks. So even if we do risk perception to get it into that calculation, that is going to have to come with, like, if I know that it's high risk, but it's the only home in a 40-mile radius that I can afford, I'm still going to buy it or rent it. because those other things will outweigh. And so I think that's where we have to do the risk incentives, but we also have to think about how we're giving other choices. Because if we're not, then it's not. And this is a huge problem. This is actually one of the reasons I think that you cannot do relocation in a just way only through relocation programs. That they have to be a much larger part of the housing conversation. Because, right, if you're not building affordable housing somewhere else, then if you haven't given anyone other options, then it doesn't matter. If we relocate you out of this place, we haven't actually given you more options, and we therefore haven't increased any of the challenges. So it's a systems level change that can't be solved through any of these isolated interventions. At least this is my argument. Yeah. Let me just do more on so I'm going to skip ahead though. So buyouts are voluntary purchases like this. As you were saying voluntary, I was thinking to myself, in the US at least, we've had lots of concern over what voluntary means in this context. So there's some, but the asterisk here is that even if we presume they are fully voluntary, there's still a lot of challenges. But there's a lot of concerns about people being sort of coerced or financially coerced. In the US, they've been used in every single state, which is, I think, mostly amusing because they aren't talked about very often. And so when I first started working on this a decade ago, I had people from FEMA who would tell me that we don't do relocation. I would say, but you have a database of relocations that you have funded. So there's like an extreme lack of awareness because no one's talking about it. It also means that one of my favorite papers in this space is about how we are not learning from past experiences with relocation. We are reinventing the wheel every time. The title of the paper is, Are We Learning or Just Failing? And the spoiler alert is we're not learning. Yeah. But so they're happening all over. I mean, you can see, not surprisingly, not as much in the West where it's not as flood prone as in the East, but even so, seeing more of them out there. There are also other agencies that fund buyouts. And there are justice issues at every single stage. So the normal way this happens is that you have a disaster or the threat of a disaster. Then the local government decides that it wants to use buyouts. It applies for funding from the federal agencies. The federal agencies allocate money to some local governments and not to others, which is, in FEMA's defense, one reason they said we don't do relocation is they just fund local governments, and the local governments do the relocation. But that's why. Yeah, it's a bit of a, yeah. The homeowners then decide, because it's voluntary, they decide if they want to sell or not. In the US, that is a big deal because the renters get no say. If the landlord decides to sell, the renters are just out. Like it's not voluntary for the renters, it's voluntary for the property owner. If they move out, if they agree, they move out, and then the house is usually demolished, in theory, because it's then damaged already from the disaster, but it's demolished and the land is maintained as open space. And so you get justice problems at every stage, from whose home is most affected, who has the most damage. In the United States, the single best predictor of experiencing damage from a disaster is to be not white. Like there's clear racist, our formerly racist housing policies, right, that dictated where people lived, and then also investments in those neighborhoods mean that we have areas that are much higher risk now are communities of color. Okay? We continue to have segregation in housing from more informal racism policies now, but we still see that kind of experience. You also have communities where they have, say, older housing built to older building codes, or older homes that are not, sometimes, I know older homes can sometimes be more resilient, but you can have disparities at least in who is in more resilient housing or in less. Who is in a neighborhood that has invested in drainage or in nature-based strategies like rain gardens or bioswales. Yeah? Communities that haven't tend to be lower income, and you therefore have environmental justice concerns about who is experiencing the disaster, whose homes are going to be damaged. Once they're damaged, sorry, that's not my computer. That will not advance my slides. Which governments have capacity to get funding? Yeah, I'll talk about this one more in a minute, but there's a real concern about which local governments have capacity to handle these issues. And then once they get the money, where do they offer the buyouts? Do you offer them to everyone? Do you offer them to pockets, right? If you have 500,000 people on Campia Flagrei, for example, you probably don't offer to 500,000 people at once, right? I mean, so you probably have to target, so how? How do you target? And how you target can have huge environmental justice concerns. I'll talk about that one again in a second. There are lots of factors that go into the homeowner's decision. which can also be tied to things, which are often things like, can I find replacement housing, but can also be things like, have I remodeled the bathroom recently? If yes, I am less likely to want to leave, right? Because I have recently invested in my home, I don't want to leave that now, I just made this, it's a sunk cost fallacy. They have recently invested in this place and are therefore unwilling to go. So there are some things, a lot of emotional and financial considerations, some of which are rational, some of which are irrational, but all playing together in terms of the decision making. And sometimes these also have environmental justice concerns. Just one I will flag is a gender dynamic. So women are more likely to want to leave after a disaster, men are more likely to want to stay. In the United States, at least, women make less money, right? And men have more geographically constrained jobs. So as a household making this decision, whose decision do you think is often prioritized? Yes, because you as a household get one say about whether or not you or the community should relocate. Yeah? And so there's a concern, or at least there's a concern here about, are we playing into gender dynamics? Are we playing into gender pay gaps? How are we maybe building on or exacerbating those issues? And then the land being maintained as open space. There's lots of concerns about what happens to the open space. So in the United States, in communities that are wealthy, the open space gets turned into a garden, a wetland, a rain garden, something that benefits the community, a park. In areas that are not wealthy and don't have resources to do that transformation, it is a derelict lot. It is grass, often trash, maybe it gets mowed, maybe it doesn't. That's it, which can actually be detrimental to the neighborhood, detrimental to the property values of people next by, can be a problem. So there's a real concern about how that land is being used and who benefits from it, who gets to use the land afterwards. There are lots of nuances in all of these, of course, so that's just kind of a highlight. So how do you do this in a fair way? The spoiler is that no one knows. Or everyone has an opinion, no one agrees, and there's no clear guidance yet on how to contextually decide this. There are several key dilemmas, but for the sake of time, I just want to focus in on, I think we're just going to focus in on one today. Oops. Yeah, all right, let's focus in on one, which is just how you allocate, right? Decide who gets an offer, who participates. There we go, maybe? All right, so we have funding across the country. There we go. And looking across the country at all those communities that had buyouts, we find that the places that receive money, so the local governments that get money from the federal government, tend to be wealthier and denser. So the big cities, yeah? They tend to get more money from the federal government. This sort of makes sense. They have resources, they have expertise, they have money already. Money gets money. Yeah? There's a couple key reasons for this. So this is a big bureaucracy. You need someone who knows how to navigate that paperwork and has time to navigate that paperwork. Right, I'm working in a community now where the guy who does this paperwork works 2 days a week in one county and 2 days a week in a different county, right, part-time, so he has less capacity. Another county, someone who does this paperwork also does animal control. So right after disaster, his priority is getting snakes out of people's houses, not filling out paperwork, right, as it should be. So places that have more staff, that have full-time planners, have multiple planners, right? Have people who have done this before, they are more likely to get more money. New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, is very good at this. New Jersey gets more money than even New York, even though it's smaller and has fewer people, and so forth, partly because they have hired former grant officers from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to apply for grants from FEMA. So they are very good at getting those grants. Now, is that bad? I mean, I don't know. They figured out how to navigate the system and they navigated it, right? All right, so once those places get money though, where do they actually do the buyouts? Well, they do the buyouts in areas that have lower income and less density. Yeah? So you get a county that has more people and more money, and then it does buyouts in its least populated, most rural, least affluent place. Partly because they can buy more homes. If I give you $1 million, you can buy $1 million home, or you can buy 10 $100,000 homes, or you can buy 100 $10,000 homes in a mobile home park. What will you do? You could help 100 families, or one family for the same amount of money. But there's an environmental justice concern if you are always targeting areas that are lower income because of the lower value homes. Maybe. So this is the real question. Is this a problem? There's a disparity, but is it a problem? Is it a bad thing? And practitioners are really divided on this. So when I talk to practitioners about this, some of them will say, that's great, that's good news. I absolutely try to buy as many homes as I can at the least value possible because I want to help the most families I possibly can for the amount of money that I have, because those families have the least amount of money to adapt in place. They don't have money to elevate their homes. They don't have money to put in flood vents. They don't have money to do all those other things. They don't have money to move on their own, right? So I want to make sure that they have money. Or maybe I think those families live in an area that has not been developed, that has been discriminated against in the past. So whenever I have a pot of money, I want to offer it to them first. Those are all very good environmental justice reasons to offer a buyout first to an area that is lower value homes. On the flip side, I get practitioners who say, heck no. Actually, they're not so polite about it, right? I will not offer buyouts in areas that are lower value because they're going to have trouble finding replacement housing. Where else are they going to go, right? I bought up the least valuable homes. They can't go anywhere else. They might feel financially coerced. In fact, we have good studies that often they do feel financially coerced. If it's their only option, if they can't afford to elevate or do anything else to protect their homes, if this is the only option available, they're going to feel forced out. Or maybe this is a place where families live because they were forced out in the past. And so you're sort of perpetuating cycles of trauma and racism in these communities. So maybe you shouldn't even offer buyouts in areas that are lower income. And I don't know, right? And when we put people like this in a room together, which is real fun, we can start to see how they make these decisions. And what's fascinating is that they are making these decisions based on local context, which is good. We want these kinds of decisions to be tailored to local context, local history, deep knowledge of what's going on at the local level. On the other hand, they're doing it at an unconscious, subconscious level that they don't often articulate, and they don't have to articulate. Which means that some people can make this decision for really racist and bad reasons, and some people can make it for very good reasons, and if you never have to be explicit about why you're making it, those things can go masked. Or you might be making it for the right reasons, but it has a bad outcome, and because I don't know why you made that decision, I can't change the way you make that decision. But also when people talk about why they stand on one side of this debate or the other, they often have this sort of imaginary reference point. I think about Key West, or someone else thinks about an indigenous tribal community or a low income urban community, right? And they have this reference point, and so they're making decisions based on that. As soon as we're explicit about that, I can say, oh, I agree, we should do that in your case, but we should do something else in my case. And maybe we both come to an agreement that we can do these different things. But suddenly, we actually are having a conversation about how we could get to better guidance for everybody. Okay? And we're just starting that project right now, but I'm really excited to see where it goes, because I'm hopeful that we could actually get to how do we make some of those unconscious decisions more explicit. So justice theories are not very useful. I'm going to skip some of this. Oh yeah. And this is my pet peeve, is that people often say, oh, well, the answer is simple, right? We should just let the community decide. I was actually even told this, I mentioned this to someone about the Campy Flagré example, and they said, oh, we should let the community decide. And I said, the 500,000 people who, what? What? How would you let them decide? Yeah. I mean, a vote, I guess, but it's gonna be really weird, right? Like that's, okay, so the community should decide, yes, but it's not simple. Like I do think community engagement is key. But when we say community engagement, or we should have community engagement, that has to be the start of a series of like 1,800 other conversations. Who is the community? Who speaks for the community, right? Do renters get to vote or only property owners? Does each household get one vote, or do all members of the household vote? Yeah, who gets a say becomes really important. Is it a vote? Is it consensus? What is it? Yeah, how are we reaching these decisions becomes incredibly important. And becomes incredibly important because otherwise you can actually make things worse in a community. And so this is one example I loved. It's a small town not far from my home, actually, where they were talking about whether or not to offer buyouts after a series of deadly floods. And one neighbor says no, because this is a historic community. It was on the Underground Railroad that helped enslaved people escape from the South to the North during the Civil War in the US. So when you see where slaves were hidden on their path to freedom, this place is worth sticking around for. Yeah. And her neighbor, who used to be her friend, said, if you pretend that human lives are worth less than historic buildings, you're a despicable person, and I don't have any bones about saying that on national public radio. You're a despicable person, right? They're not friends anymore. But also, but just as an example of these kinds of debates and decisions can actually make things worse in a community. So there's a movement now for what's called trauma-engaged or trauma-informed community engagement. I am not an expert in this. This is an area that I think is fascinating, though, is how do you facilitate community conversations in a way that doesn't result in this? Yeah, that results in something that is more informative for the community. So just a way of saying that when we say the community should debate, yes, they should, but also in a way that is structured and supported to not make things worse. And then there's also this question of scale, because sometimes the things that the community wants are the wrong decision from another standpoint. And I like to pick on these two places. This is Dauphin Island, Alabama. It has been rebuilt 16 times, at least. Yeah. They have paid in $9 million to the National Flood Insurance Program and received $72 million out, plus another $70 million in disaster aid. Yes, to rebuild those 60 times. And the debate is now whether or not the state should pay several $1 million to rebuild a bridge that connects the island to the mainland in order to enable this community to stay. Well, the community wants to stay. The community has decided, even though only about 10% of the community members actually live on the island. The rest are vacation homes that they rent out. Sure, right? Does that matter to our calculation that they don't live there? I mean, I think it should, right? So I like to pick on them. Right? Sure, the community made a decision. Sure. Okay. And then this one is in Florida, because Florida is always easy to pick on. The road there was sort of functionally abandoned, but not legally abandoned. And so those developers went in and put in new homes, and those homes moved in. And then they sued the county and said, "You're not maintaining our road." And the county said, "Yeah, because it's falling into the ocean." That's why we abandoned it. They lost, and so now the county has to maintain that road. And the cost of maintaining that 1.5 miles of road is more than the county's entire transportation budget. So the county now has to basically raise taxes to enable 5 homes to live in a place that they knew was flood risk prone when they moved in. Is that right? Is that allowing the community to decide? So, I mean, you can see which side of this I'm on, but I'm on this because I think on the one hand, justice, we want to say that justice means giving people agency over their homes. We want to say that it means enabling rights like staying in your home, staying in your community. And on the other hand, we need to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't enable abuses of the system, which is what I think is happening here. I think this is an abuse of the system. Okay. So how do we do this in a way that protects rights in a meaningful way, but doesn't enable this kind of thing? And so it's all very, very complicated. My big takeaway is really just that we need to move away from platitudes. Right now, so many of the conversations that I see in the environmental justice space or the coastal justice space are things like, well, we need more community engagement. Okay, great, but what does that mean, right? Well, we need to empower local communities. Okay, but what does that mean, right? We need to do something that's equitable. Uh-huh. And which of the 15 definitions of equity are you using today, right? How are you thinking about that? And so those should all be great points that we should agree on, but we should also then move beyond them to something more. Yeah. So, and that's where I think we're trying to get to, is moving to that something more. And so just to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about creativity, because when we're thinking about the future that we want, I do think that one of the answers to this is to play more games. It's not just because I enjoy playing games, but also, seriously, it is. So we want transformation and we want something new, right? We're moving to an area of non-stationarity, so stationarity is dead. We need transformation. We need to do something we've never done before. And if we want to do something we've never done before, we might need to act in a way or think in a way that we haven't done before. And so this is going to require some creativity. And thankfully, creativity is a skill that we can all build. And one of the ways we can build it is through play. So there's actual psychological research on the benefits of play, that a playful approach, that actually having play time, that playful engagement with things builds, right, more productivity, more creativity, greater health and happiness. All things we would want for ourselves, for the communities we work with, for everything we're looking for. But we need more of this. And this can mean that we do things like hiking, or riding motorcycles, or other things that are play. But it can also mean literally playing games. There are lots of board games out there right now on building resilient cities. I haven't seen anyone building resilient coasts. Maybe that's our next project. We build a bunch of games on resilient coasts. It'll be fun. Floodland As You Are, it doesn't say it, but it's basically set in a post-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans. So you are like rebuilding society after a major hurricane, and you make a lot of choices that are interesting to see. The Sims 4 is an eco-lifestyle. You can actually run bond measures to try to convince your neighbors to invest in a community solar panels, recycling program. So thinking about how you communicate, how you build collective action, but through The Sims, right? A game that millions of people play. And I think about this because millions of people will never read anything I write, but they will play a game. And so that's kind of a cool, right, engagement point. And then it can also mean reading fiction. So I find fiction a much easier way to think about the shared socioeconomic pathways. For example, Nicola Aristotle are the ones who mapped different fictional books onto the different shared socioeconomic pathways. But there are other reasons to engage in these. One of which is that fiction provides more diverse voices. Yeah. So as opposed to a lot of people who look like me telling you what I think about the future and what it should look like, right? I think it's really cool to read Blackfish City and think, or Swan Book, or The Marrow Thieves, and think about an indigenous perspective of the future, or a black female perspective of the future, or a queer and transgender perspective of the future. What would that look like? What is different about that than what I do? And so all that kind of creativity can be great for thinking about what the future could look like, and what viewpoints am I missing because I have my sort of privileged blinders on. Yeah, so how do we think about that? There's art, some of the coolest work in this space. I really like the Netherlands Water Steam Museum. I think it was fascinating for raising awareness around why you need investment in these kinds of actions. But I'll point out the Underwater Homeowners Association as an effort by Xavier Cortado in Miami. He works with neighborhoods to paint on the sidewalks how many feet underwater their neighborhood will be in 2100. And so it's beautiful. It's also, as you can imagine, quite a conversation starter to signal to everyone that your home will be 6, 7, 8 feet underwater in the future. So it's a really interesting way to get conversations going in that space. And then, actually, I didn't make you write haikus, but haikus are actually another way that have been shown to increase creativity. And so the reason I think haikus are fun for the future is not only because they can create creativity, but also because I think so often when we think about what the future will look like, especially if you're a modeler, we can get very hung up on the modeling details, or I can get very into the scenario planning of it. But what we want you to do at some level is just understand at a gut level, which is grok is up there, it's a science fiction term, but it means to sort of understand something emotionally. And so just emotionally speaking, right, we should pay attention to our gut checks. When I say, it's only economically robust to armor 13% of the coast, and your gut says, ooh, that's not ideal. We should listen to that. Right? It's not scientific, but it says something about a future we don't want, and we should then use that to investigate why don't we want that, and what is missing, and how can we improve on that. So when we have these haikus or pictures, I recently made my class actually draw pictures of the futures they want. Right? So artistically trying to express that is not scientific, but was fascinating to see what they focused on, how they came up with those things. And so that's it. Those are my solutions for the future, right? How do we think about the coast that we want? We need to do more and eat our veggies, meaning don't build in the floodplain, but also just do all the little basic things consistently that we know are good for us but that are hard to do, which is way more challenging than it sounds. We need to figure out how to live in a world that is not stationary, but is changing all the time. How do we think about adaptation as a choice process rather than as an outcome? And then how do we do that knowing that justice is complex and probably local dependent? And I think we do some of that through play, which hopefully means that there's some optimism at the end of this. So it was kind of all over the place, but thanks for sticking with me on it. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Saida. It's a very inspiring, as usual, provoking ideas, because we should have that to be more effective. So, questions from the audience? I have a few written, but I'd like to have others starting, maybe, if possible.
You had one.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times people living near the flood won't want to leave, not because of anything else, but because of the fact that they have roots to the place. Like I come from.
Yeah, maybe the people would like to hear your voice. Can you go next?
Can you hear the
to
questions
computer?
from the audience? If not,
can you hear? Yeah. Why don't you
The left
come on,
computer.
just a second.
left. Yeah, thanks. I I keep looking at this one because of the camera, but yeah.
Yeah.
Place of the roots attachment.
Sure. So like my question was that like a lot of times like from where I come, it's the biggest city in Pakistan actually, and there's a lot of indigenous fisher folk who live over there that I have worked with, and the government actively like works against them. I think that there is usually like an assumption of democracy, but it's not really true in like a lot of South Asian countries especially. So they don't want to leave, but they get like a lot of garbage dumping at the coast. There's a lot of like fights that they're fighting against the government and against like people who are trying to move into the places that they're at. So they don't want to leave, even though in 2022, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure you know that Pakistan had like some of the worst flooding ever.
Yeah.
And they actually took a lot of other people from like the interior areas into their places, even though they didn't have enough either. So there was a lot of like fundraising activity happening. So my question is, sometimes people just don't want to leave because it's their land.
Yeah.
So
No, this is a really good point and a really difficult point. And this is where I think this local context becomes so important, right? Because I think that some people have very deep ties to the land. Some people have not deep, legitimate ties to the land, but we pretend that they do, or they weaponize that as a way to try to stay. Yeah? Which is what I also see happening a lot. We have generational ties to the land too. You have 2 generations. Like that is not, yeah, no. Right? Like you've lived here since the 1960s. Right? But so sometimes I see this weaponized, and sometimes it's legitimate. And sometimes it's about deep ties and connections to the place, and sometimes it's about deep ties and connections to the place and historical injustice that has led to people being where they're at. And I think that we need to treat those differently. And this is what I mean about not, I think that sometimes when we say like, oh, everybody should be allowed to stay where they are, I think it's actually a problem because we enable people, like those homeowners in Florida, to say, oh, I should be allowed to live where I am, right? Not the right answer. And we ignore the fact that one of the reasons like an indigenous community in Pakistan should be allowed to stay might be because we have committed such horrible injustices against these people in the past that allowing them to stay, enabling them to stay, not just allowing, enabling and paying and protecting them and their ability to stay is actually a form of reparations for past injustices. And that's a very different calculation, right, than like it sets it apart in some ways. I think it's a different calculation. And so I have sort of 3 answers. One is when there's like a historical injustice, I think that then there should be a lot of effort put into enabling and paying and allowing to stay, enabling to stay, or to stay to their risk tolerance. People also have very different risk tolerances. I don't want to tie a kayak to my front porch and kayak in and out of my house to work, but I know people who do. Right? They do that to stay in their homes because it floods so often they can't park a car and they can't walk in and out of the water. So they, okay, we have a different risk tolerance, and they should be able to do that. And that's one category. The second category would be people who have deep ties to the connection, but maybe don't have that historical injustice. Okay? And there I have a slightly different feeling, because there I think, yes, you should be able to stay. But there I have more of a question of how much other people should be able to have to pay to enable you to stay. Right, Dauphin Island, Alabama. Some of those people have deep ties to that connection. They've lived there 4 generations. Does that mean that other people in the community should have to pay to maintain their ability to stay? Should we put other first responders' lives at risk to have to go in and rescue people? Right, like I am then concerned about, so then I think there is sort of a cost of, yes, enabling to stay up until the point where it overwhelms some other person's paying. And then I think there's people who are weaponized that we should like absolutely get out. Yeah, so I don't know if that's coming, I'm still working on this one, but I think there's a big difference between those scenarios. Yeah.
100%,
yeah. But my concern is that I think we are coming out with guidelines that treat them all similarly. And so that is my concern.
Yeah, that's what I meant, like when I was talking about how there's like an assumption of democracy.
Yeah.
Because like the Pakistani communities, like the ones that are at the coastline, they are the ones who are actually paying for the rest of the country's like
yeah,
negligence essentially.
Your
I don't know how well they
speech
can.
is really closer to reality than the science we pretend to do somehow. I mean, I have the feeling that you have a much closer view to reality. But on the other side, we are optimistic that connecting the physical and the ecosystem science that we are developing with the socio-economic component, and I include also the policy issues that you have presented, we still could be able to find solutions to repair, to restore. So how far are we still, let's say, do we still have a gap? Do we have a gap to close between this type of science you do and the one we do more on the physical ocean or ecosystem? So you feel that we will reach some advancement in restoring and protecting what we are losing today, or is all gone and we better plan?
Yeah. This one I also have mixed feelings on, because I do also have hope about restoring and protecting in places. I think one thing that is the downscaling, which I know some of what you're doing is already thinking about really local, right? If we want local control and we think local control is important, then giving really localized information is important, like at a level that a town mayor thinks about, right? And that's very difficult to do sometimes, but it's also translating that into things that they care about. I was talking to someone, we were talking to people who are working on glacial melt, and we're talking about sea level rise projections, right? And 8 or 9 millimeters, well, maybe it's 8, maybe it's 9. We really should refine that. And I'm like, I'm working with people who are planning for 0 millimeters of sea level rise. So, so your uncertainty bar around is it 8 or 9 a year is like not, it's not on their radar. But it's partly because I think we haven't done the work of translating that into, and here's what that means for your town, right? Or even, wetlands are dying. Okay, but no, wait, what it means for your town is, right, that this park will disappear and you'll lose X dollars of tourism, and that will lose these something that matters for them on a, and you can change that by changing what people care about, what matters to the town. I've seen towns that have succeeded by running interesting campaigns. A town in New York, an environmental group ran a huge campaign to get them to care about a small turtle, an endangered turtle. And because they got people to care about that turtle, they got them to care about the small wetlands. And because they got them to care about the small wetlands, they got them to pass a new law that would protect those wetlands and prevent new development, and so on and so forth. And they didn't do it by projections of, right, here's how your wetlands are being lost and here's blah, blah, blah. They did it by, aren't these turtles cute? Let's take turtles to every single elementary school. Let's make a documentary, right? Like, it was a very different approach, but it got to and I think you can do both, right? I don't think it's an either or. I don't mean to say that that's the only way they could have done it. Just that I do think sometimes we're still stopping a little short, right? There's a whole lot of research that shows that just giving people better information doesn't lead them to make better decisions. And sometimes it's because it's like the housing thing, right? It's you gave them better information about one criteria, but they had 18 other things that they also have to care about. Or yes, the mayor cares about the wetlands, but also has to care about, right, everything else. And so sometimes it's, I think sometimes we still need more partnership with our communications friends, or to get more journalists on our side, or to get more of those artists to, to do things. So I still think there's a lot of collaboration there. 'Cause I agree with you, and I think there's a lot of potential there. And I don't know if that always comes down to just the scientists. I'm a big believer of teams. Right, so I don't think this has to be anyone in this room has to do all of the above, right? But what we need to do is just think about how we could collaborate with and feed into others in our teams.
Okay.
Oh, my call has dropped.
We have
it's still running.
It's fine. We have hands from the virtual world. Okay, so I see here, if I can read. No way. Gloria Mozzi. I don't know if you were the first one, but the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Risk Assessment and Adaptation Strategies at CMCC in Venice. And I want to say I really liked your presentation, especially also the final note on the creativity and artistic side, which is something that, as scientists, we don't see that often. So thank you for that. I actually had 2 questions, one quite fast. Like, I was curious how you defined transformation. So is it like a quantitative as like a rate of change, or is it more substantial qualitative aspect? And the second one is, I think, more complex. Is more like how does politics fall all into these? Because next week, actually, this weekend we're gonna vote for the European Parliament, and you mentioned that we have to do more and more. But for example, like, I'm personally scared that the outcomes, the elections outcomes will actually be that, like, the change that we need will be a pushback. And like you greatly presented that it's like everything is quite complex, especially with regards to justice. But I have the feelings that with populism is getting up, and people don't want complex problems. They want simple and fast answers. So how is it possible? Like how is it possible to do more in these? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the easy question. So transformation, there's a paper by Termeer et al. That we used as a framework for it. Has depth and scope and speed, different criteria for it, but essentially boils down to having a sort of non-linear shift, a shift in the fundamental principles of a system. That's what's transformative about it. So it is more qualitative, and you can define that sort of like, what do you think the fundamentals of a system are? Right, is in itself kind of a subjective question, but are you challenging those fundamentals? That's the idea. And there are more nuances and more debates on, like, can incremental adaptations add up to transformation over time and under what conditions and so on and so forth. But I think on some level, whether it's short period or long period, I think we are looking at, for me, the main thing behind transformation is that fundamental shift. That we can't keep doing business as usual with a few add-ons. We have to do something fundamentally different, right? And I'm increasingly convinced about that. And so, at least, and especially over the long term, right, or midterm, I don't know, 2100 kind of thing. We have to do something different. And so that actually becomes really interesting, because sometimes you can see the short-term benefits, like, why do people build in risk-prone areas? Well, there's economic benefits, or we like this place, or whatever. And you can see that, say, by this time in 2100, right, 2120, that place will be 2 feet underwater. It won't be a choice. Like, it won't matter if you want to live there or not. It just won't happen. Or the volcano will explode. It won't matter if you want to live there or not. Right? Like it won't matter. But what do you do in that mid period? That mid shift is really important. And so that transition between the two becomes incredibly important. And I think that's where a lot of our emphasis should be, is on that transition period for the transformation. And the politics is, so it's an election year in the United States. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are our two main candidates. So yes, I'm with you on the politics, taking up a lot of brain space these days. Yeah, but to that point, so I think there's a couple answers there. Like, one is that even when the politics are as bad as they can be, right? Even when they're as bad as they can be, there's still a lot of gain that can be done at the local level, and you can still achieve major transformations at the local level. And so transformations maybe just shifts the scale, right? Maybe we aren't going to change the entire US economy, so instead, like, I mean, if we elect Donald Trump, right, I'm probably not going to worry so much about trying to change national legislation. I'm going to focus on, like, what can we do in Delaware? What can we do in Pennsylvania, Maryland, the states around me? What can we do, push there to transform those states? Because they could still do a lot, even without federal support. Yeah. What can we do under existing mechanisms? Because again, there's a ton that can be done. In Florida, actually just yesterday, they passed legislation that I thought they would never pass. They passed legislation to disclose, to tell home buyers whether or not your home is at flood risk. Now, if that sounds insane, that's a new thing, I agree, but they did. And they did it under Governor DeSantis, who has also just removed the words climate change from all of the websites, right? So he's making big changes, even though he doesn't think climate change is real. Because someone still could go in and convince him that for disaster risk reduction, for safety, for all kinds of other reasons. So I think there are still ways to transform. We just have to change our strategy a bit. So that'd be one thought. Other thought that I'm far less certain about, but I have been thinking about a lot, is at what point do we lean into our identities not just as scientists, but also as citizens, right? Like, should I write another paper next year, or should I lead a massive protest? Both could take up an equivalent amount of time. Yes. But like, if I think that radical political transformation is required, maybe I should start investing some energy there. I'm not sure what that looks like, right? But I'm coming to, and I can say that the full confidence of someone who is newly tenured, and therefore are able to make those calculations in a different way. So I don't know if that's an answer for everyone, but also it is. So it's something I'm thinking about, though. Is I do think we need much more radical changes in our political system as well. It's like there's also places to push for there. Yeah. But you can see I'm less comfortable with that one. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would say now we have Laura Winter. Are you there still? Hi.
Yeah, hi. Hi, I maybe come from a slightly different perspective, which is interesting, and I did miss the first couple minutes of your presentation, which I'm now really disappointed about after hearing you just talk. So I'm currently working on a project that is looking to perform that kind of midpoint transformation that you speak about. So I'm working on a project funded by our environment department in our government, specifically on the Norfolk and Suffolk coast, which is the fastest drilling coastline northwest Europe. And we're working on is a project called Resilient Coasts. And I would be really interested to hear your viewpoint on how you introduce adaptation to communities, because that's what we're aiming to achieve, but through 8 different streams of work. How you would introduce the concept of adaptation to them when they are at imminent risk, and maybe don't have that aspiration to make that choice to move, which is, I think, a really interesting way to phrase it. And then the second part of that is that they do also have this inherent belief that the government will just somehow come up with a way of giving them money when they don't currently qualify, because they don't have the size and the properties and the businesses to equate the funding they would need. Which also feeds into the viewpoint of, whether we should defend or not, because we have a beautiful, lovely that likes to erode.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So actually, I'd love to email you offline, because there's a working group exercise that I've only tried it out with students so far, but I actually really like it and would love to share it with you, at least for generating ideas. But some of their suggestions that I have tried elsewhere are, you don't start with relocation, and you don't even start with the risk. So to start with a conversation about who they are as a community, what they care about, and what they want to be in the future. And oftentimes this is grounded in a history of the place that shows the change in the place over time. Because if you can shift people into a mindset of change is always happening, right? Change has happened and is continuing to happen. And now we're going to talk about what change you want to see continuing in the future. If you can put them in that mindset of change has happened, change is occurring, change will happen. Okay, now let's have a conversation about what kinds of change you want to see in the future. Here's a baseline of here's how the coast is changing. Here's how some of the economics is changing, right? So let's bound it a little bit, but mostly let's start with that. And then I've seen people do, literally haikus. People do participatory mapping, people do artwork, people do photo voice, but a lot of times it's something creative about how do you envision the future, what you care about most, right? Like take a photo of the thing you care about most in your town. It's often not a building. Yeah. Sometimes it's things like the coast. But we have a coast near here where I live where people have ponies, there's wild ponies. People take a ton of photos of the wild ponies. It is a very different conversation to say, let's talk about how we preserve the wild ponies in your community, as opposed to let's talk about preserving your house, right? It's a very different starting point.
Attractive.
Yeah, but it started from something they told me that they care about, right? So it's not me saying, right? It's them telling me that. So that, and then I do have the conversation where I say, all right, now we're going to figure out how you achieve your goals for the future using only your own resources. No reliance on external resources. If external resources come, they're a windfall. But because we want you to be a sustainable community, and a sustainable community should not require routine injections of funds from an external source, what would it mean for you to be a sustainable, viable community, right? And that does get really tricky. Yes. But I think if you lay the groundwork with the what do you want to be as a community first, it helps get there. And there's always pushback. It doesn't work all the time, right? But yeah, and I've also seen conflict mediators do this really well. So there's some actually people who are trained in conflict mediation leading these kinds of conversations, which is far better than a lawyer who is trained in conflict instigation leading it. So yeah, I think it's a better place.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. I think also it's an interesting viewpoint for us because we are like a local government authority, so we are still going in, having that conversation in that way could also still give them the perception that they are going to get helped in some way. But we have discussed the idea of that third party, and potentially that's the feasible route. But
I think
yeah,
a
no,
third
it'd be
party is
interesting to speak offline.
Yeah, no, I definitely think a third party is a good idea. Yeah. Also because of trust issues. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think on the line of this point, the last one, I have been trying the past year or so to read more on clarifying ideas on differences between resilience and adaptive capacity. Okay. I saw you were writing with Mac. You have a Mac Insider Science 2021. I love Mac. She is, for me, an exceptional writer of this aspect. And most of us, we focus on resilience because, resilience means you have really to find a solution, right? Mm-hmm. But adaptive capacity is more than that. So, I tried to understand it includes resilience. But not. So what is your view on this topic? A bit philosophical, and then I have another one.
Oh, so I'm a lawyer who you just asked about definitions. Yes, let's get semantics. So I think resilience used to mean bouncing back. It used to mean a return to baseline. You withstood a sudden shock, and then going back. Like an elastic band has resilience because you can stretch it and it snaps back, right? And how much you can stretch it and how quickly it snaps back, that is resilience, like originally. And then it was sort of realized that was maybe bad, that systems that were, that staying the same, right? That staying status quo is bad because it means you're also locking in everything that's wrong with the status quo. So maintaining, right, poverty can be extremely resilient. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a shock out of it. That's a bad thing. Yeah. So it has been redefined, and in its redefining, I do fall into the camp that thinks that resilience has now been defined to mean everything, to the point where it is kind of meaningless. Mm-hmm. Resilience now just means something good about dealing with hazards or catastrophes or issues. And it's not really a thing, in my opinion. Which I think has benefit to the politics point. The US has managed to pass legislation about building communities that are resilient to extreme weather events. Okay. We can't pass legislation on climate change adaptation, but we can pass resilient community because what does resilience mean? Well, whatever you want it to mean. So we can do that. So there's benefit in having those terms.
In a legal document, wouldn't you have to specify what it meant?
No, which is unfortunate. Yes, and which leads to lots of problems. Yeah. You can't. You do have to define it, but you can define it to mean something like systems that stay the same or change or achieve benefits.
The paper that I read on resilience, they have a definition of what they mean by it.
Yes, but often you'll get a definition like the IPCC, which is something like retaining, resistance
functionality
to
after disturbance.
Yes, and not being disturbed, but also adapting to change. So it used to say just returning after and maintaining your fundamental traits, but now they've added on a clause at the end that says or adapting to change
The
often.
first one has like the assumption of stationarity.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But now they don't want to have that, and so now they're trying to redefine it to mean
Yeah.
also adaptation, which is why I have qualms about it. Anyway, so in terms of it, but I still use it when I talk to people because I think that it is a quick term that people understand at a gut level. So when talking to, say, community members about your floodplain, your floods and resilience to floods, they get that in a way they don't get some of the more technical terms. But I think from a legal and a technical standpoint, I don't think it actually means that much. Adaptive capacity is very usefully defined in the IPCC as the capacity to adapt. So that one is also brilliant. And there's lots of papers that try to define it better. But I think it does ask an interesting question, especially when faced with systems that are going to need to change over and over and over again. Sorry, I have a whole dissertation on defining adaptive capacity, so I won't give that one here.
Wow,
Yeah, no, that was my PhD. So I have lots of thoughts on it. But I do think that fundamentally, I think it boils down to something like the ease and speed with which a system can change. Yeah, and so that's what I mean by something like, if you're going to build.
Which means innovation.
Well, it means innovation, but it also means just like the implementation. Right? So it also means that you have the people, you have the know-how, you have the funding, and that you have things in place or can acquire them easily, like without a lot of bureaucracy. And so it's not just about having money, it's about having money that you can access and access quickly. It's about having, right, not just personnel, but personnel who know how to get those things done relatively quickly and easily. It's about having systems in place. It can be about a lot of other pieces. It can even be about an engineering perspective. When you build a levee or a seawall, you can build it in a way that will just be this height, or you can build it in a way that will enable future seawalls to build on top of it more easily. Well, building in that second way is sort of building in adaptive capacity because you are enabling that wall to be adapted in the future more easily. Right? So I think these are the kinds of things that we're going to have to start thinking about when we think about adaptation as a series of steps rather than as a one-time switch. Yeah.
Last word that which impresses me, because I never thought about it, is the fact that, and I always had a feeling from my past experience that this was very important, is I think we should also devote a bit of time with lawyers and with other people that know how the system works on using the law. Because most of the bad things also happen because people don't have so they feel everything is bureaucratic, everything is very difficult, and then they avoid. They try either to do something outside the law, which is normally not correct, or they try to twist it. That is wrong. So I think training to use existing laws, because law is normally done that can be interpreted. I've been told by my good Italian lawyers that you interpret the law. It's not the law that tells you what to do. You interpret in order to do things. What do you think about that?
Well, it is definitely true in the US and the UK and other, call them common law. So in common law, we have very little law, and then lots of how judges have interpreted the law. And all of those judge interpretations become the law. And then you have civil law countries that write more of it down. And in theory, they require not as much interpretation, but often still, but in practice still do, right? And so all of them end up being a mix. But definitely there's a lot of interpretation. So so we can write the word in resilience, and then people can debate, what does that mean? Or we can even say things like, this should be given to communities most in need, and then have generations of lawyers debate, what does that mean, right? And there's two things. So I do think that people, well, one is that the whole legal field itself, I think, is realizing that it has a problem. The law and most of our worldwide government systems are not designed to change rapidly. In the US, ours was specifically designed to be slow. We specifically designed it with 2 houses. Maybe not as slow as it is right now, but it was designed to be slow with 2 houses, so that there wouldn't be so much fast change that anyone could, basically that no dictator could come in and do something horrible.
Exactly.
Right? That everything would be slow, and so that people could, you could foresee what was going to happen. It would be predictable. We want governments that are predictable and stable. Well, that means that we end up with things like Major League Baseball in the United States is not a business. It is not a business because the Supreme Court decided back in like 1912 that it was not a business. And that's it. Now you're done. That was decided, right? And so we're still dealing with a decision that was made 100 years ago and is wrong. We're also dealing with a court that decided in like the 1940s how to measure beach erosion rates and sea level rise in ways that are wrong by today's standards. But how do you undo those things? How do you fix them? And the law is very slow to change. And so I think law itself is trying to figure out how do you keep up, how do you become faster at change without losing the stability. And so there's a huge tension there. And I also, so I am not a legal scholar, I don't study the theories of law, but I have been told that even when I'm not doing legal research, I think like a lawyer, which is often an insult, but but even when like Katie Mock tells me I think like a lawyer, she means it, and I don't think she means it insultingly. I think she means it in a good way. But I think she means that I think a lot about the definitions, but I think a lot about incentive structures. So I think a lot about how you're setting up a structure that incentivizes, right? People talk about the law as a way of channelizing your thoughts. You go through certain processes, and as you go through those processes, it makes you think about different elements along the way. Or it nudges you to put more weight on this value or that value. It makes something the default. Right? We've all seen the research on if you default into saving your money, if you default into not, right, do you have to opt in or opt out of a retirement savings plan? Right? People do better if you have to opt out. So what do we set the default? Right? Is the default opt in or opt out? So I think a lot about how do we set up a structure that makes the default positions, what are the easiest, right? We want to make people making safe, resilient, sustainable, right, decisions. We want those to be the easiest default decisions possible. How could we set up a system that would make those the easy route instead of the challenging route that they are right now? And I think that's what would be fascinating from a societal standpoint, is we've set it up to make all of these decisions hard, right? And how could we, what shifts would it require to make them the easy path? Because if we could make the incentives make this the easy path, then right, that we wouldn't have to fight every single battle. We could sort of let the system work itself. So I think that's where I think like a lawyer in terms of how do we set up that system at the start for it. Whether or not we can do it, I don't know, is a whole other challenge, but yeah, at least it's fun to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you online for those questions. Really appreciate it. Oh yeah, no, I'm not gonna,
How much the least of that?
We have